Thank you. I think that the conference will last for about 1 week at least, in order to cover all the areas that the night they just introduced. But let me tell you that I would like to start saying that democracy is a process. You never reach a point where democracy is ready. What a nice country. Now democracy finally has been achieved, because you never achieved that. And because it's a process, democracy is like a tree. You have to nurture with a little bit of water every day in order to have a very strong tree. And sometimes we forget that, and we take democracy for granted. And this is not the case. We used to take democracy for granted in Chile, and nobody cared about democratic Chile because democracy was there, till the moment that we lost democracy. It's like air. You are not going around saying, what a clean air we have today. The problem is when you have pollution. Then you complain about how polluted is our air. I say this because sometimes we thought that we have reached the optimum, and this is not the case. It's always a challenge in order to keep a democratic system working, because democratic systems change the demands, because citizens change demands. It's true. It's true that now we can say, look, democracy is back in the region, in Latin America. Yes, it's true, democracy is back. It's true also that in the late 90s of the last century and in the first decade of this century, democracy was back in a sense that all presidents have been elected. Nevertheless, because democracy is a process, in many cases, citizens protest of what's going on, walking on their feet. And they go to a square demanding resignation. It's true, quite a number of presidents wouldn't stand the protest and resign. But all of them that resigned were replaced according to the legal institutions that those countries have. And this is a big difference from what we used to have in the past. I'm not saying that it's normal to have so many presidents being kicked out of office because of the protest, but at least institution has been working. There was one exception that was not the case, Honduras in 2010, but again the reaction of the other Latin American countries was so strong that even today the new president that is in Honduras has some problems with regard to the rest of the Latin American community. Anyhow, democracy is back, but the challenges that we have today have to do with challenges that are in several countries, not only in Latin America, and some others that are typical from Latin America. The first challenge that you have is how much democracy are you going to have in order to deal with national issues or regional issues. How democratic institutions are you going to have if you have a federal system of government, like in the US, like in Brazil, like in Argentina, like in Mexico, or if you have a different kind of government by which the national government plays the role. And then you have discussions, how much is going to be the degree of autonomy of different regions vis-a-vis a lot of public policies, and how much a big number of those policies are going to be national policies being applied in similar ways all over the country. And if you see what's going on now in Spain, well, you will have a very interesting discussion with regard to how much autonomy and how much a national country is going to remain together. But let me tell you that I think that probably the most important challenges have to deal with the new technologies of information and have to deal with global problems. And then I will refer to more domestic issues in the region. With regard to the question of the new information technology, I think that what we are facing is similar to most democratic countries. We know that the democratic system normally are exercised through representation. You elect people to play the role as a president in Congress, as parliament, etc. So democracy by definition is a representative and has to be a representative democracy. The question is today, when you have the new information technologies, when it's possible to be informed right away what's going on where, to what extent democracy 2.0 is changing the way to perceive a democratic system. Until what extent then the big issue is how much representation, because you need to have a representative authorities, and how much participation, which is quite an open debate. Can you have a very open society by which a particular number of citizens can say that they don't agree with what has been approved by a new legislation in Congress, and you call your citizens all over the country to have a signature asking for a plebiscite to abrogate the law approved by Congress? This is not possible to think that in the past, but what about today? I'm not saying that we're going to have so many plebiscites like the French, like the Swiss people, that has a plebiscite for everything. But till what extent? Why? Because for the first time, democracy is changing. In what sense? Democracy exists because Gutenberg imagined a printer. Of course, the printer was to publish books. It took about more than 200 years till somebody discovered that through the print, I can have a journal, and to have a paper being published every day. Okay. And because a journal was going to be published every day about the issues that are of interest for everybody, then some French philosophers across the channel, because the first paper was published in England, decided that, well, it's possible then probably to have not only the king and those around the king making decisions about democracy. And therefore democracy emerged, because now everybody understands what they are talking about. But democracy means that some leaders put a point of view, and in a democratic system, citizens make decisions every 4, 5, 6 years. Now, there was an expanding of the democratic concept, because at the beginning, only those that have to know to read and write can do it. Only those that have some properties, so that they are interested in public affairs. Not to say anything about women, because women had to remain at house. But that was the way it was, and then you were expanding. And when you have the radio in the 20th century, then it's possible that you also know about the world affairs and national affairs, listening to the radio, then you can have the people that doesn't know how to read and write. But always, always, in a democratic system, you have leaders that present some ideas about the future, and the citizens react. Now, today, for the first time in history, everybody can emit opinions, like a leader, but everybody can react to the opinions of the leaders immediately, right away, in a tweet. And you just make a beautiful speech, and at the time that you are talking, you can see what is the reaction in Twitter. So to some extent, you can say that because of this new technological information, we are going to be back in Athens. Not today Athens, of course, because they have some other problems. But Athens in terms of Pericles, okay? And therefore, how are you going to be able to make compatible. That now everybody can react, and therefore, what kind of democracy? How much representation and how much participation? I don't want to go beyond that, but when you read what about the pirate party in Germany, you have an idea of what we are talking about. You should go to see how it's run the pirate party in Germany and what's going on. And that party now, I guess, I understand, is about 6 or 7% of the electoral citizens, and therefore they qualify for that, and in the next general election they will have people in the Bundestag. The second point has to deal with those issues of public policy that belong to the question of that now, in today's world, globalization is here to stay, and therefore there is quite a number of issues that are not going to be solved at the national level. If you are talking about climate change, it's not going to be solved at the national level, no matter how important a country is. Or if you are going to be talking about trade, about the international financial architecture, about the financial regulations, about the migration. Yes, I know in many countries people consider migration a domestic policy issue, like in this country, and you see what's going on now because of the presidential election. But let me tell you, you cannot, in a civilized world, to consider the question of migration as a domestic policy issue. Human beings have been migrants since human beings exist in this planet, 1,000 years ago. And as Carlos Fuentes, by the way, was also a professor at large in this university. Carlos Fuentes used to say, in this Latin American, in this American continent, all of us are migrants. All of us. The first one arrived here 16 or 70,000 years ago through the Strait of Bering, and during those happy days, nobody asked them for a passport or papers. Then, 500 years ago, some others arrived from Spain and some other European countries. Later, some others arrived from African countries. But how can you consider the issue of migration today in a globalized world, where everything is globalized, with the only exception of human beings that cannot go from one place to the other? Big question. And the question is not the question of north to south, or south to north, to be more precise. The question is that migration exists everywhere. And this is a tremendous challenge. I can think, I can understand from countries like the United States, like the European countries, etc. But as well as you have that, what about pandemics? What about drugs and traffic of drugs? And all the discussion about how long are we going to criminalize and to make a crime the question of consuming drugs, etc., etc. In other words, if it is possible to deal those issues as a domestic policy issue, when you have a country like the United States that consumes about 25% of the drugs at the world level, and at the same time you have a country like the United States that most of that money will go to those that are producing drugs and return to the United States because the traffickers would like to buy some American weapons. In other words, it's difficult to think that those issues are going to be domestic policy issues. And something very interesting would be to say how many tunnels are discovered in the frontier between Mexico and the United States. And as far as I know, most of the tunnels are discovered in the Mexican side. To think about, if that statistic is true. In short, the question of these issues about what kind of democracy, how we're going to be dealing with this, is quite simple. It seems to me that we are at the end of the Middle Ages. At the end of the Middle Ages, you don't have national states. You have a much more smaller way to run at least in the European area. And the beginning of the national place means a transfer of sovereignty from the duke, the count, or whatever, to the king. And there's a huge discussion who is going to print the currency, who is going to be the owner of the defense, of the army, who has power to decree what are the new laws, at what level, and there was transfer of sovereignty from the different regions to the national level. And the modern national state was established. And then you have then France, you have Spain, you have the UK, etc. But there was a transfer. How much transfer of sovereignty? Because this issue will have to be tackled at the world level, and that's another huge discussion on how we're going to arrange that. But after saying this, that are general issues, I think that when you go to discuss the issue of Latin America today, with regard to democratic systems, I think that the most important change that has been taking place is because Latin America, first of all, has nothing to do with the economic crisis for the first time. We are innocent with regard to that. But at the same time, let me tell you that Latin America, particularly South American countries, are having a tremendous growth, and that means that in many of those countries now you have an emerging middle class, and in many of those countries they have learned how to run the economy, and many of those countries they have learned how to focalize expenditure and to reduce poverty. And it seems to me that the biggest challenge that the democratic system has today is that it was much easier, we discovered, to defeat poverty and to reduce the number of people living under the poverty line, rather than to satisfy the new emerging middle classes in most of Latin American countries. And let me tell you also that it seems to me that once that you are approaching in quite a number of countries, something we will talk tomorrow with regard to this group of people coming from the 14 scholarship, to some extent, what happened is that when you have countries approaching the $20,000 per capita income, according to IMF, Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Costa Rica, and some others, during the next 10 years are going to be countries above the $22,000 per capita income. And there is a very close correlation between per capita income on the one hand and the way that you are able to solve social and economic issues demanded by the people. Life expectancy will increase if you increase per capita income. Infant mortality rate will increase. Level of education will increase. Up to a point. And if we are to believe many books, like one that is called The Spirit Level, they say, look, beyond the 20,000, it's not per capita income what explains the differences, but it is distribution of that income. That means that countries like New Zealand has a much lower per capita income than the United States, but perform much better in terms of social and economic problems. And then the question that you have to ask from the point of view of a democratic system in Latin America, where would you like to be, Latin American countries, when you reach the yardstick of the 22,000? And needless to say that in today's world, Latin American continent and Latin American countries has an extremely uneven distribution of income. Historically, it has been so. We have been able to reduce poverty, but in most of our countries, the distribution of income has remained the same. And it is to say that there are two different things. To reduce poverty is one thing, to improve distribution of income is another. And let me tell you that Latin American countries, with one exception, in most of them, distribution of income is exactly the same before and after taxes. Not to be very proud of. And therefore, I would say the major element that now we have, when you have countries have been able to have a very rapid growth like the Dominican Republic, well, the big issue is going to be what are we going to do with regard to social cohesion, social mobility, that are essential in order to have a better and stronger democratic system. It's not possible to have democracy if you keep talking about how much growth you have, but people feel that that growth is reaching somebody else, but not my house, not the school that I'm sending my kids, not the primary health center that I used to go, not my social security for when I'm going to be old. In other words, it's very difficult. Democracy has to deliver. And if democracies are unable to deliver, then we are in problem. And everybody used to ask me what's going on in Chile these days, and I would say, well, we have been quite successful. I promise as a candidate that tomorrow is going to be another Chile. And I think it's another Chile. It's different a country with 40% of the people living under the poverty line than 11%. Taking the United Nations figures and not the government figure that say that it's 14%. Anyhow, that's another discussion. But the point is that if you have a reduction of people living under poverty, the big issue is what about the 20-something% that leave poverty behind and now have different demands to the democratic system of government. And needless to say, we discovered that it's much easier to reduce poverty, to focalize very well your government expenditures, rather than the other way around. And therefore, the big challenge in today's Latin America democratic system is how are you going to be able to fulfill those demands? And there are not very easy answers. Because to fulfill those demands means to change, to some extent, some institutions like the tax system that we have, which is not easy. As Galbraith used to say, whenever you mention the word tax, those are very poor smile. You think that something may come of them. And those rather rich, it's rather uneasy because somebody is going to take out from his pocket or her pocket. So this is a tremendous challenge, I would say. And the issue of income distribution is going to be in the center of the debate, because at the very end, the question is what kind of society are we going to have? How much social inclusion we have in our society, and how we're going to demand. And because Latin America has been able to have a rather large economic growth, now we have a different demand. And therefore, I think that in a discussion here, if you see the case of the Dominican Republic, and I'm sure that the President will talk on that, after 8 years in office, he changed the Dominican Republic. But the major problem, like what about energy, in the Dominican Republic is a tremendous problem to answer, because now the demands of energy, because the growth of the country has been increasing a lot. So I think that, to conclude, I will say at the introduction in this part, we have in our democratic system challenges that belong to all over countries. What about how to deal with global problems? How to define what public goods are we going to produce? But probably the most important is that because Latin America is going from a continent rather poor, where poverty was the major item in the agenda, to a continent that now is quite a number of countries that can be classified as middle class, then probably What do we have is a different challenge. Final point. Final point is that the way that we have had growth during the first 10 years in Latin America is more than double the median growth rate of OECD countries. More than double. And therefore, it's quite a challenge in terms of are we going to be able to keep that growth rate so that we are converging our economies to a more developed world, if we are able to do that. But that's a matter of a different discussion. But this is what is producing tremendous tensions with the kind of the democratic system that we have. And unless democracy is able to deliver what is the demand of the people, democracy is in danger. The question is how to deliver. And I think that this kind of discussion probably are extremely important if we are able to learn how to deliver in a democratic system. Thank you.
First of all, let me begin by thanking Professor Snyder for such a warm and generous introduction here today. And also let me say that for me it is truly a great honor to share the floor with President Fernández y Lagos, someone who I admire and respect so much for all that he represents in Chilean and Latin American history. My political generation began admiring all the progressive movements that were taking place in Latin America, the end of the 60s and the 70s, and just knowing that President Lagos was a cabinet member of the Allende government was, for us, a sense of inspiration, a source of inspiration. And then after becoming president and doing so much for his country, our admiration has only grown. So it's truly an honor, and I'm excited to be here with President Fernández y Lagos today. And I would like to begin from his premise about democracy as a process. I do share the vision that democracy is a process, and that it is always an unfinished experience. You achieve certain goals, but you move on to some others. And the first thing I would say about Latin America that we talked about this morning is that through its 200 years of history since independence, for the first time in the last 3+ decades, Latin America has become democratic. Democratic in one sense, in how you have access to power, how you have access to office. It is for the first time that the only legitimate, acceptable way of having access to power is through elections, where people can cast their ballots through free and fair elections with active participation of all political actors, being recognized by the international community. So there is one problem that has been solved, the legitimacy of access to power. Nowadays, it is not acceptable to have coup d'etats, military coup d'etats, or to have left-wing guerrillas. Even at this moment, as we all know, there is a dialogue going on between FARC and the government of Colombia, with the participation of the Cuban and Venezuelan government in Oslo, in Norway, in order to find a solution to the long-standing guerrilla movement in Colombia, the FARC. So what I'm trying to say is that no longer is there a possibility for a left-wing guerrilla movement to have access to power through other way that is not elections. Even well-known left-wing movements that were previously involved in warfare or guerrilla warfare have gained access to power through the electoral means. And we can think about the case of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas first came to power in 1979 as a result of a revolution that took place against the Somozas. The classical, typical Latin American revolution where you have a dictator and a progressive or even left-wing movement coming in, toppling that movement and having access to power. The three most distinguished cases would be Cuba, 1959 revolution, the Sandinistas in 1979, and the Nuju movement in Grenada also in 1979. So, but that is not possible nowadays. You have the Sandinistas being defeated at the polls, the beginning of the 90s, and then coming back to power also through electoral means. In El Salvador, Frente Farabundo Martí, de Liberación Nacional, was also involved in a guerrilla warfare at the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s. The Sandinistas did not come to power through guerrillas, through warfare. They came to power through elections. You have in Uruguay, and I know some of you are from Uruguay here today, right? In Uruguay, José Mujica, and Pepe Mujica, right, was, as a young man, very active in left-wing politics. I even remember him saying that he had a .45 caliber around his hips, that he was very willing to use back in his youth days in favor of revolution. But how did Mujica came to power? Through elections. So the first point I want to make is that for the first time in Latin American history, the only legitimate way of having access to power is through elections. No more left-wing guerrillas, no more right-wing coup d'etats. It's through elections. Having said that, however, we have to also take note of the fact that during the past 34 years, at least that I remember, 18 elected presidents have not ended their terms. So that means that some adjustments still have to be made in the way democracy functions, the way it operates in Latin America. But I think following on President Lagos' premise of democracy as a process, we can go now to a second stage, from electoral democracy into more economic, social, culturally, and environmental democracy, with more representation and more participation and a multiplication of actors within the political scenario, which I think is the case in Latin America. So I would say that nowadays, what we're going through is a more complex situation than it was before. Complex internally, more complex internationally, and of course an interaction of global forces in a domestic situation. And I think it is important for young leaders to understand this, because it's not always your personal will that will determine political outcomes, but how you manage the interplay of these different forces: economic, social, political, cultural, internal, external, acting all at the same time with this multiplication of actors that I've talked about. So let's look a little bit within this new stage where we go from electoral democracy into more economic, social, and cultural democracy. In the economic side, well, for the first time we have seen Latin America with a sustained economic growth. This morning we talked about the Latin American decade from 2003 up to this moment. Perhaps with the interlude of the global financial crisis now becoming a global economic crisis. But as President Lagos said, the global financial crisis was never a financial crisis in Latin America for one simple reason. Not one bank failed in Latin America. Not one bank was part of the contagious situation that has taken place worldwide within the financial system. What we have had in Latin America as a result of the financial global crisis has been a problem in our international trade because imports and exports decreased as a result, as a direct consequence of the global financial crisis. And because there was a reduction of international trade in the year 2008, 2009, governments were not able to collect revenues as they did years before. So there was a drop in fiscal revenues to government, and because of that also there was a reduction in government spending that would go to the social services or that would go to infrastructure. So Latin America was not immune, has not been immune to the global financial crisis, but it has not been a financial situation in our countries, but more an impact in international trade that has had other effects, which we are seeing today. In today's headlines, we see that there is a reduction of international trade as a result of what is going on, especially in Europe. The situation of economic recession in Europe, accompanied with the implementation of austerity measures, has dropped imports into European markets. And because of that, there is a slow of the economy in China nowadays that exports to the European markets. The US economy has been growing very slowly, only 1.5%. It was projected initially that it was going to grow beyond 2%. It is only 1.5. China is going to grow only 7.5 this year, as has been indicated by IMF and other organizations that are forecasting economic growth. And by growing 7.5%, which means a lot, nevertheless, it is the slowest economic growth in China in the last 22 years. The last time China grew 7.5% was in 1990. So there is going to be a significant drop in economic growth in China this year. Now, China has been the driving force for economic growth in Latin America, especially the Southern Cone, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Peru, Colombia, etc., that have been exporting raw materials to China in the last 10 years. So if there is a drop in economic growth in China, there's also going to be a decrease in China importing goods and services from Latin America. Therefore, we can forecast that economic growth in Latin America in 2012 will be lower than in 2011 or 2010. What I see as a danger then is that in 2007, 2008, the global financial crisis was limited to the US and Europe. Nowadays, it can really become a global economic crisis because it will be affecting China, affecting India, and affecting Latin America. So I think that in 2012, we can see that the global financial crisis has transformed into a global economic crisis that we can feel, that we can see through a drop in international trade that will trigger some other difficulties for the management of our economies. So that is a major challenge that we're going to face in Latin America this year and perhaps the years to come. There was a question about the sustainability of economic growth that has been achieved in Latin America in the last 10 years. We have said that it has depended on China being the key driver. China purchasing, importing goods and services from Latin America, but especially raw materials that have not been transformed, little value added to those products and services. Speaking about copper from Chile, iron ore from Brazil, cereals from Argentina, or mining products also from Peru, or meat from Uruguay, etc. Now, there will be a need in the years to come for these Latin American countries to transform their raw materials into new value-added products and services. There is a need to go back into manufacturing. There is a need to go back into transforming these products and services and being part of the global chain, and diversifying your exports, not only to China, which of course will continue to be in the future a great buyer, because China, because of its enormous financial resources, will be a key player in the future. But the wise thing to do for any nation nowadays is to diversify its exports. Not only look at one specific market, no matter how good that market has been, but to diversify. You can put your products and services in different nests around the world. So the major challenge is this: how will the global economic crisis evolve? On this, I would just like to say very few words, the way we see it from the Dominican Republic, which is not the best place to analyze global affairs because you don't always have the information needed. But nevertheless, we see this. Up until now, there has been two lines of thought on how to overcome the global economic crisis. One has been that in order to really put on our backs the current economic crisis, there is a need to stimulate the economy, injecting new resources. That can be done through two ways: fiscal policies or monetary policies. Due to the gridlock in Congress in the US, monetary policies have been implemented. Since the bailout of the banks in 2008 to the recent resolution adopted by the Federal Reserve Bank that $40 billion will be allocated monthly to buy bonds from the banks in order to introduce new resources into the economy, make the economy grow, and generate new jobs. This is the Obama administration's policy on how to overcome the crisis. There's a European side of it, which is the main problem has to do with the debt, the sovereign debt, which related to the GDP is growing. Even so, in America, nearly 100% of the GDP is already related to the debt in this country. GDP is $16 trillion US. I think the debt has come to around $15 trillion US, 90%, 95% of the GDP. So it's very high. But the question is this. The question is, what do you prioritize in this situation? And in order to answer that, there are two ways. Short-term and mid and long-term policies. In the short term, what President Obama has been trying to do is to reactivate the economy, make the economy grow, and that can only be done through stimulus packages in the economy. The European way is not prioritizing economic growth, but reducing the debt and controlling fiscal deficit. And for that, instead of injecting or pumping new resources into the economy, they have applied austerity measures, which means cutting the budget. And because of that, because of the implementation of austerity measures, there is a recession in Europe nowadays. And because of the recession, there is, of course, no new jobs. The recession has created a social problem. The social problem has created a political problem, and now you have street protests almost every day in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain. So there's a question of governability in Europe at this moment. All this can play for the future, for the near future of Latin America. But in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say about the two lines of thought in solving the crisis is that it's a question of sequencing and timing. What is your priority? Making the economy grow or reducing the debt? These are not incompatible. At some point, you have to make the economy grow and you have to reduce the fiscal deficit and the debt. But what comes first is the question. In America, President Obama's policy has been to make the economy grow a priority. In Europe, up until now, it has been reducing the fiscal deficit and the debt a priority. My belief is you have to make the economy grow, you have to create jobs, and just because of that, automatically, the debt related to GDP will diminish. And you have to be responsible fiscally, mid, long term. But in the meantime, the short term is creating new jobs and making the economy grow. Well, this line of reasoning will have an impact in Latin America. Depending on how these things operate, will have an impact in Latin America. If austerity measures predominate, then there will be low growth in Latin America in the next 2 or 3 years. If the idea of injecting new resources into the economy to make it grow prevails, then Latin America will grow in the next few years. But because of that, there are new threats that have to be taken into consideration. If you allocate new resources into the economy through monetary means, most likely there's going to be inflation. So one threat that Latin American leaders will have to face in the short term, if this idea prevails of injecting new resources, is that there's going to be an increase in prices of goods and services, something that we do not have at this moment in Latin America. So the question is this. Up until now, the global financial crisis has not affected the continent as a financial crisis. It has affected as a trade problem, but the problem is still pending because the crisis is still hanging on, and there seems to be no solution at the global level on how to address and solve the problem, not even at the G20 level, because of differences between the Europeans and the United States. So there is the complexity of the problems we are facing today. Let's go back internally then. There's the economic democracy. So economic democracy cannot be solved at the local level, domestic level. It will depend on global situation. Politically, there are new elements, as I was saying before, that make the situation more complex. Before, it was always understood that power lied within the state, within the government. And if you had control of the state of the government, you had power in Latin America. It's not so today. There has been a multiplication of of sources of power, as I said before. For example, today, alongside political parties, you have social movements that have taken a major position in our political system. We all know about all these social movements in our different countries. Some of them are peasant movements, like in Brazil. El movimiento sin tierra, no? The landless peasant movement, which has been very strong. But there are different movements for different issues. You have for environmental issues. If, for example, the government is trying to implement a mining contract with a major company from abroad, now extracting the minerals from the mine nowadays has become very difficult because there's always an opposition to extractive industries in Latin America. Everywhere there is a mine, it can be copper, it can be gold, it can be silver, it can be whatever, there's always protest about extracting these resources in all Latin America. So it makes it difficult if you depend on mining products politically, because you'll have a political dissent on that issue. It has to do with the environment, it has to do with women's rights, with all different kinds of issues. There are social movements that operate nowadays. The role of the media is now more critical to governments, because there are two elements that have been incorporated into the operation of democracy. One has to do with transparency, and media is always questioning transparency. There's always, of course, the culture of scandal, the need to create a scandal within government. And so the questioning of corruption, transparency is always there, presented by the media. Sometimes it is true, sometimes it is half true, sometimes it is out of context, sometimes it is manipulated. It all depends. But if it comes out, it creates a difficulty, a problem of image for the government. It's a question of accountability that we didn't have before. Now, just by being elected, you become a suspect. You have to present an audit account of what are your actives, your assets. No? And when you leave office, once again, you have to present the results during your term, that you have not enriched yourself, and you can prove that you have not enriched yourself. This did not take place 20 years ago. This is something very, very new in Latin American politics. Accountability, transparency, and the critical role of the media. And as President Lagos was saying now, the role of the social media. The role of the social media, not only for Latin America, but worldwide. When we look at what has been happening in the Arab world recently, it is quite interesting to make a reflection, and I will end with this just to begin the conversation, but I find it so interesting that I cannot escape the temptation to share it with you. When you consider that one individual, just one individual, made a trailer of a movie that nobody knows if it really exists, and uploads this movie, this trailer, into YouTube, in a borderless world, wireless, with no limitations in terms of freedom of speech. Either you do well or you do evil, because apparently there is no control. The power that the social media is having is tremendous. It is tremendous, because nowadays the individuals feel empowered to present their vision, their image of what's taking place, and the capacity to mobilize people through the media is not only putting the message, but to mobilize people through the media, this new media outlet. Now, if it is to promote democratic values and ideals, I mean, it's fine, it's okay. I think it will make a great contribution. But it is not always like that, as it never happens. This is why we talk about brightnet.com and darknet.com. There are two sides of it. It could be for good or it could be for evil, as I said before. Now, what happens if it is for evil? What can you do? And I think here there's a problem that we have to really reflect, and it's a problem that we have to discuss and debate. President Obama, in his recent speech at the UN, when he talked about this problem, he said, you know, I reject the idea of uploading this image, this movie, this trailer on YouTube. I feel disappointed with what this person has done. It was not authorized by the US government. This is something that he individually did. But we cannot do anything about it. He didn't say it exactly in these words, but this is the interpretation. We cannot do anything really about it because the First Amendment in the US Constitution guarantees free speech, the freedom of expression. And of course, there is a tradition with the US Supreme Court that even hate speech is considered a civil right protected by the First Amendment. So it seems that there is nothing you can do with the US legal framework to prevent someone, an individual, from doing evil through the social media. Now, this is the US model. There's also the European model. There seems to be differences between the European and the US model just about everything. I would say this: freedom of speech is a constitutional right, but it is not an absolute right. There has to be limitations to it. And you can see limitations in cases like libel, defamation, obscenity, pornography. These are all limitations that we have in our national legislations to the use of conventional media, traditional media, but it can be applied to the new media. Now, if we look at the UN level, there are some pieces of legislation, beginning with a Covenant for Political and Civil Rights, that indicates an explicit prohibition to hate speech by the use of the media. And this is universal rights. But there is also a covenant on discrimination, racial discrimination, that prohibits hate speech. So there's a problem here of a global legal framework prohibiting hate speech, considering hate speech an infringement to the law, considering it something that will harm the other's rights to a reputation and to the practice of their religious faith, their ethnic backgrounding, but here in the States it is considered a right. So I think now, of course, it is not explicitly stated in the First Amendment of the US Constitution. It has been an interpretation of the US Supreme Court. But if you consider now the harm that has been made through this, I think there's a need to reflect upon that. I just read yesterday that the individual that uploaded the film in YouTube has been arrested. But not because he uploaded the film, but because of previous violations of the law here in the United States. So they went into his file, they found out who he was, and they arrested him, but not because of what he recently did, something he did before. But it was a need to send a message to the Arab world that this man has been at least stopped, in what he was trying to do. So I would say, President Lagos and Richard, that all these issues, about the use of the media, social media, new social movements, political parties, professional groups, new actors that participate within the political realm, creating new difficulties for governability within a democratic setting. This we didn't have before, and this makes democracy, especially if you're aspiring to office, more difficult and more challenging. But nevertheless, it can always be overcome. Thank you very much.